DJ, welcome to the show.
Jake, thanks for having me, man. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, so I finished your book over the past weekend. I've had it. It's been sitting on my shelf. Ever since I got it, I was like, I need to dive into this. I want to dive into it. I knew we were having the conversation. Literally forgot it on my trip to Aruba for a pair of speaking engagements. And so when I got home last week, I was like, this is what I'm doing this weekend. And so I had it on the Peloton with me. I had it on the couch with me. Couldn't put it down. It's one of those books. It's a really easy read, but also an enjoyable one where you're getting stuff out of. And as we have some shared relationships, experiences, Brian Kane, some other folks, I could see things sprinkled in from people I know that had an impact on you. And so let's start here. Before we dive into Push the Sled, talk to me a little bit. You grew up, your dad has been involved in coaching and training high school and high school students and staff for a while. And so you kind of pursuing some of this path as well with your podcast and some of the work you're doing, I always find interesting. And I'm curious what made you curious to pursue it. And I say that, let me set that up. I grew up, my dad had a small gas station in East Texas. He grew to a small chain around East Texas. But I grew up working in the stores and I realized this is not what I want to do. So being around it all the time made me go the opposite direction of, I may want to own a business, but I don't want to do that. You have kind of followed some similar paths as your dad in terms I noticed, especially with the book. So talk to me about that, not only growing up in that environment, but really the curiosity to maybe pursue and forge your own path down it.
Yeah, man, Jake, you really did your homework. That's awesome. So my dad is a motivational speaker. My mom's a teacher. So I had just two all-American parents that really just see the value in giving back and working with the youth. And so I like to tell people kind of candidly, I grew up in an auditorium, man. My dad, he's speaking, doing keynotes all over the country a couple times a week. And so I have a lot of memories running around auditoriums, helping him set up stuff, handing out stickers, doing all the fun stuff like that. And so, it was about 2.5 years ago where I said, hey man, why don't I come with you to one of your keynotes? And I'm a little bit older now, and I just want to watch and see what you're up to. I haven't seen you perform, or I haven't seen you speak in a while. So hey, come on with, we'll do it. And on the way down, now I've been doing this podcast for about 5 or 6 years, so I'm getting a little bit of a public voice as well. And on the way down, I'm thinking to myself, I hope he doesn't pull me on stage today. This isn't about me. I'm just here to spend some time with my dad and kind of see what he does. And so I said in the car, I said, Dad, you're not gonna pull me up on stage today, right? He said, no, we won't do that today. So okay, sounds good. Well, sure enough, in a 3.5 hour workshop, we're about an hour and a half in, and he yells over to the side, DJ, why don't you come up and tell the story about XYZ? And I'm like, oh my gosh, here we go. And so I get up on stage and I tell a little story and go into some of the stuff that I talk about with mental performance. And man, I tell you what, Jake, it was right away. I was like, this is awesome. It's a feeling like no other, and it's addicting, and you feel this high, and you're impacting the youth, which is such a pivotal age. And more than anybody, being on stage, just that presence and that power that you get. And so that's kind of what made the turn for me was, wait a second, I can do this. I always watched my dad have the crowd at the palm of his hands. I mean, thousands of people at a time. And I always thought, I couldn't do that, man. That's awesome that he can do it. It's probably not for me. And although the crowd wasn't very big that day, I think there was a little bit of confidence for me, Jake, to know, I think I can do this. And so that's kind of how it started as far as the speaking goes. And then from there, we decided to write a book together. And now we're looking to get into more schools and work more together because we believe that we're better together. So a long story short, that was a pivotal moment for me about 2.5 years ago.
Love it. Okay, so we're going to get into the book a little bit more, but let's flash back because I know we have similar experiences. Obviously, you at a very different level, but when we talk about, say, CrossFit, right? And you were heavily involved in CrossFit. You were at regionals events. You did a CrossFit Games. That whole community is something where we really ultimately started in 2010 as well, kind of getting into that space. I'm curious how you or when you started translating or desiring to translate the physical aspects in fitness that not only you were going through as a competitive athlete in that sport, but as someone coaching and training others to really at focusing and investing more on the mental side, because we know they're linked, but a lot of times we don't know how to link them, especially when you're in the athlete mode versus when you're in the coach mode.
Totally, man. And before I answer that question, I got to tell you, there's an event called the Granite Games that's been up in St. Cloud, Minnesota for probably the last decade or so. They just stopped doing it. But I got to tell you, man, it was back in 2013. It was my first time at the Granite Games. I was a spectator, just getting into CrossFit, figuring out what the heck this thing was. And I'm walking around what's called Vendor Village. For the people out there listening that don't know what Vendor Village is, it's where all the vendors set up. You can buy a bunch of cool gear and spend a lot of money. I tell you what, Jake, one of my first things I ever did when I got into CrossFit was I bought a Compete Everyday shirt. And it's so cool because 10.5 years later, I'm talking to the guy that started this brand. I mean, it's such a cool full circle moment. And so I've been following you and wearing your stuff, and I've seen your brand for almost 11 years. It's pretty cool.
Awesome, man. Dude, I remember we did Granite Games a few times. And I remember I made the drive from Dallas to St. Cloud once in the Sprinter van. Straight up 35 pretty much the whole way, and I thought, I think I'm going to fly this next time. But it was always a great event, right? Because it was September, totally. Perfect weather up there, a little chilly sometimes for this Texas boy in September, but what a great event. So that's really cool because I obviously knew where you're based out of and from, but didn't realize that would have been one of the first events we would have crossed paths.
Yeah, man, so cool. So that's awesome that we could connect there so many years ago and then get on a show today. But to answer your question about when that translation happened, so just to catch people up a little bit, I had an opportunity to play college football up here in St. Paul, Minnesota at a school called St. Thomas, a Division III school at the time. They're Division I now. And after I was done competing or playing football, I was still desiring that competitive outlet. And I was kind of unique compared to my other teammates. Jake, I loved the off season. I loved lifting. I loved seeing what happens when you put in the work. And, I was the guy lifting during the season when other guys were like, hey, man, now's not the time to max out your back squat. So I loved the competition side of things. And once football was done and ran its course for me, I remember driving home from St. Paul, Minnesota to Lakeville, which is about a 30-minute drive. And going down 35, I was having a lot of thoughts in my head. What am I going to do now? Football's kind of over. I've been doing this for a long time. And sure enough, call it a God thing, call it what you want, but a CrossFit gym was getting built at the time of me driving home in 2013. And I was like, CrossFit? Okay, interesting. I have no idea what this is. I step into the gym, I meet the owner. The rest is kind of history. I dove in head first. I became a coach, a competitor, an athlete, and like you said, I had the opportunity to compete at a pretty high level for almost a decade at regional events and the CrossFit Games. And I did that for about 9 years. And about halfway through, I started the Mindset Advantage podcast. I was listening to a ton of podcasts. I went to college for business. So getting into the fitness space, although I loved working out, I didn't have any really formal education on it. So I kind of went to the resource of podcasts because there's so many out there. And that's how I self-taught myself some of the nuances of fitness. And so I got to a point where I was like, man, Jake, I'm listening to podcasts every single day. Every day I'm listening to podcasts, and I still do that. But why don't I just start my own? If I'm listening to so many, why not just start my own? So I started my own back in 2018. I think it's been now almost 6 years here. And from there, I was about halfway through, so about 3 years in, about 2021, I was introduced to a guy named Brian Kane. And you and I both know Brian
Kaner.
A little bit. Brian, yeah, Kaner's amazing, man. He's had, out of all the people in this world not related to me, he's had the most influential impact on me. And I got a chance to sit across from him just like we are right now across the screen, had him on my podcast, and he changed my world in an instant. I mean, just like that, he introduced me to the mental game, what it looks like, how to develop it, and I fell in love right away. And my first thought was, man, how do I get into this? Do I have to have a PhD? Do I have to go into school? Do I have to write a book? Like, what do I have to do? And he took me under his wing, and long story short, he was able to kind of show me the ways of being a mental performance coach, a speaker, and an author. And so I was able to understand what the mental game was. Before that, before 2020 or 2021, I had no idea there was a mental side of sports. I grew up playing every sport you could. I was always in the backyard playing whatever sport was on TV that night. But I never really understood the importance of the mental game until I met Brian. And so from there, the rest was history. My podcast really changed its route. We talked to a lot of mental performance coaches. It's really centered around mindset now because I believe that is the difference maker. At some point, you're going to meet somebody in your life that has the same level of physical talent, the same speed, the same explosivity, the same on-the-field IQ. And I believe the only thing that's going to separate you guys is what's between your ears, those 6 inches between the ears. So it's become a real passion for me, is trying to help student athletes understand how to develop the mental game. I say all the time, I think people know what it looks like. They can point to somebody that has a strong mental game, but the how isn't really there. So my passion is to educate student athletes on how to develop the mental game. So that's kind of where that transition happened.
So let me ask you, as you were diving down the journey with Kaner, what was one of the, I would say, either mental performance skills or perhaps obstacles that you were suddenly aware that you had as an athlete that you didn't realize? Like, for me, it was realizing very much the constant me versus you, and how that focus was always on things outside of my control, and my emotions would fluctuate off of it, versus like being mindful what's in my control, pulling all the focus back. So I'm always curious, like talking to athletes of like, because it's, you don't know what you don't know. And then when you start to learn it, you're like, oh, that's why I did that. What do you remember as one of the first ones that was like a eye opener for you past your athletic days, but looking back, you're like, that's why I did that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jake. And, I'm still having those moments, man. Like, I'm still having those moments of, holy crap, I didn't know. I mean, every week I do a podcast, I get to learn something from somebody that I had no idea. And that's what's so great about being a podcast host, as you know. But, actually the answer is pretty similar, man. When I was taught what's inside of your control and what's outside of your control, it changed my life, man. It absolutely changed my life. And it so happened to be around the same time that I picked up the Daily Stoic from Ryan Holiday. And listeners out there, if you need a daily read or you're interested in something, you don't know what your next book is, other than Push the Sled or one of Jake's phenomenal books, I would highly recommend Daily Stoic. Awesome, quick read. And one of the things that I picked out really quickly, Jake, was the difference between what's in your control and outside of your control, and how we spend so much time on the things that are outside of our control, and really spelling that out for athletes. Is it other people's opinions? Is it the media? Is it injuries? Getting really crystal clear on what's inside and outside of your control. And then sometimes what I like to tell athletes too is that it's okay to focus on what you can control, but I want to ask a little bit more. I want you to master what you can control. And so I spell it out with an easy acronym of APE: your attitude, your preparation, your presence, and then your effort and energy, APE. So if you want to get the things that are outside of your control, I mean, because we all want some of those things. We want to stay healthy. We want to win games. We want to have good statistics. We want some of those things. So in order to get some of those things that are outside of our control, we need to double down on what's inside of our control, our APE. The more we can double down on that and master those things, the more you'll see some of those things on the right-hand side kind of trickle over and kind of come your way sometimes. So that was a huge aha moment for me, and I think it's something now where when I get the opportunity to pass that back down to a student athlete and I see the light bulb moment in their eyes of, I never thought of it like that. It's one of the best moments. I love seeing it in kids' eyes because it truly is life-changing.
Okay, so when did you graduate high school?
2011.
Okay, so you were 11. So I was 2002, just about a decade ahead of you. So you were really in high school, the early-ish days of social media kind of being part of your high school experience, whereas now it's like ingrained in everything. And we've got this culture of highlight reels and, I look at like highlight reels on basketball, and high schoolers are like all about the dunk or not a lot of the fundamentals, which is one of the things I love, like Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors during their big run is like it was passing and shooting. It was fundamental basketball. It wasn't the early, like if you remember the early 2000s after Jordan, it was sloppy ball. Like it was sloppy ball. And so there's a lot of distractions around high school athletes that I didn't have to deal with. I was really confined to my teeny tiny town in Texas and what I read in the paper and knew about other schools in the area. For us, Dave Campbell's Texas Football Magazine, which is like the holy Bible of Texas football. But growing up now and the athletes like you work with, it's a whole other world. And I talk to parents all the time around this stuff. And so as someone who works with high school athletes, who talks a lot, who has a book for high school athletes, the integration of social media is not going away. Like they may try to change things regulation-wise, but it's there. And it's part of it, and it's hard not to get sucked into it. And so for you, if you could help me with kind of two parts to this. One, how do you encourage athletes to control what you can, especially when it comes to their feed? And then how do you help and encourage parents on the support of that relationship with social? Because I think for a lot of our listeners, we have some athletes in high school and college that listen to this, but we have a lot of folks that are parents. And the parents are like, I have a high school athlete, I have a middle school athlete. Like, I can tell them this all day long, but they're going to get sucked in the rabbit hole. And so if we could break that of like, hey, here's how we focus, here's something to think about with social, and then parent, here's a way to support it because you're still mom and dad and they get tired of hearing from you.
Totally. Yeah, man, that's such a powerful question. There's a lot of nuances in there. And I'll be the first to say that, social media does have its positives. I'm not here to say that it's all negative. There are some positive aspects of it. There are a lot of negative aspects of it as well. I think the one thing that to first start, Jake, is to understand that there are billion-dollar companies out there that are designed to take your distraction, to take you away from what you are doing. And they're all programmed in these apps. So one thing that I've learned through my podcast talking to people that are kind of behind these walls is that we're not strong enough to overcome these billion-dollar business ideas. You just got to know that. So in order to know that you're not going to beat these people, you need to come up with some boundaries for yourself. So for some people, it's sweat before screens. Kaner says that all the time, that you don't get into your phone until you get your workout in first, or maybe you get through first hour, whatever it is. You kind of set up parameters in the AM and the PM. Because for most kids, they're in school all day. They're probably not on their phone. So what we really can control is the 5 to 9 AM and the 5 to 9 PM. So let's get really, really granular about what does that 5 to 9 look like? Well, maybe it's the first hour of my day I'm not starting with social media. Maybe it's the last hour of the day I'm not ending with social media. That could be a strategy for some folks. I think when we're talking about comparison, comparison is the thief of joy, right? It literally steals joy away from you. And high school kids are the first to agree with this, and they know that. So instead of thinking about, and I love how your message aligns with this, that it's not about competing with everybody else. What you say, Jake, I love so much, is it's about competing against yourself, being better than you were yesterday. Because here's the deal. You're always going to find somebody that's faster than you, that's better looking than you, that's stronger than you, that's smarter than you. You're always going to find somebody out there that has these qualities that you don't have. So don't waste time trying to compare yourself to other people, because you're always going to find somebody that's a little bit better. So instead, what I encourage people to really focus on, especially student athletes, is compare yourself to you, compare yourself to who you were yesterday. Instead of competing with others, how can you collaborate with others? Instead of competing with others, how can you collaborate? So instead of getting jealous about the guy who's in front of you and maybe you're a quarterback, you're second string, he's first string. Instead of really competing against him and getting mad about him being, how can you collaborate? How can you have some questions? Hey man, can we work together? Can you teach me how to do that 3-step drop? Can you teach me how you read the defense? How can you guys work together? So comparison is the thief of joy. Let's collaborate and compete. I would say a little bit of both, and make sure that you're comparing yourself to who you were yesterday, not who you were today. And then finally, just know that you're not going to overcome social media. It's too big of a monster. So know that going into it and set up some boundaries that you can. Maybe it's the first start of your day and the last start of your day. Maybe it's something different, but set up some boundaries so that you don't have to try to fight this beast. Does that answer your question, Jake?
It does. And I laugh as you're saying that, because like for parents, like you think of this idea, think about going to Vegas, and I love going to Vegas, and I will take a little bit of money to spend at the blackjack table for fun, but I'm not expecting to come home with that money. Like if I bring it home or bring more home, that's a huge win, because the odds are against me. The casino has data and research, and everything is set up to work against you. As a random stranger told me my very first trip to Vegas, those beautiful hotels were not built off winners. And so when you think about a casino, and Vegas is billions and billions of dollars designed to get you there to spend money and to gamble thinking I'm going to beat the casino. You never do. Like you may get lucky once, but in the long run, the casino's going to win. Social media is that on crack, because they hire people from casinos to talk about how we can hook you in. And there's a couple of books. Irresistible is a great book. Hooked is a great book as well. Mm-hmm. Stolen Focus by Johann Hari is a phenomenal book for any parents listening. That all is designed to that. And so I love the idea of stop thinking you're going to beat them and just change the relationship you have with them. And I think that's a lot more freeing, because I think for a lot of us, when you try to beat social and you don't, because you can't, it's all pulled in, designed to trick you and pull you in, you're going to be pretty demotivated and deflated, because you can't ever get ahead of it. But when you understand it and you change the relationship with it, you can set better parameters and boundaries to your point. It's like Kaner talks about, right? If the expectation going into a 100-mile race he has is that it's going to be difficult, you're prepared for it versus, oh, this is going to be easy, and then you get crushed a tenth of the way in. And so that's a really important concept for us to talk about. So one of the other things kind of pulling on that from the comparison standpoint, I always love to ask other people this, is really locking in with those teammates, right? How do we become a teammate? And I think this is an applicable message for adults as well in the workplace. But how do we become a teammate who, even though we're in competition with that other person on the depth chart, we learn to want them to become their best because it forces us to raise our game and become better. And instead of seeing them as a threat, we see them as something we're grateful for. How do we kind of teach that in this world of like, I've got to have the scholarship, I've got to have the start, I got to do all these things versus like, hey, I'm grateful you're really good because that's going to make me raise my game to find out what I'm capable of versus coast, do what's comfortable. How do we get people to kind of buy into that idea of competing with themselves ultimately that we talk about? I'm curious kind of just what you reiterate with that. And maybe it's some of what you just shared. Maybe you have another idea that layers in on top of that I think is beneficial for not only the adults listening, because we get caught in the same trap high school kids do, but maybe for those parents as well.
Man, that's a phenomenal question. I would love to hear your answer on this too. You know, I think some of this stuff really starts from the top. And what I mean by the top is either the parent or, in this case, the coach. What type of culture are you instilling? Are you instilling a culture where everybody's involved? And I don't mean everybody is playing. I understand in a football game or in a basketball game, 5 people playing, in a football game, 22. I understand that. But are we giving some roles and jobs to people that aren't necessarily on the field so they do feel a part of it? That's something that's super simple for coaches to do, is just make sure that everybody feels a part of it. Because once kids, especially kids, don't feel a part of the group, they start to want to check out. So make sure that everybody has a role on this team and a clearly defined role. Hey, this Friday night, I need you to do X, Y, and Z. Be really clear on the expectations and the standards. Having that conversation, even if the expectation or standard is something very minor, hey, I need you to be really loud on third downs. I know you're not going to get in much, but I need you to have an impact on the sidelines. Okay, coach. I mean, once you have those little conversations, that can really help to create a lot more buy-in. So I think that's one concept. Another one is just making sure that coaches set the standard of, hey, this is how we roll. This is how we talk to each other. This is how we act. This is, as Urban Meyer says, above the line behavior, below the line behavior. This is what we're going to tolerate, and show some examples. This is what we like to see, and pull out some videos of, you know, a backup quarterback congratulate Jalen Hurts. There's tons of videos of him when he gets pulled out in the national championship game and Tua Tagovailoa goes in. Jalen Hurts is the first one there congratulating him, getting hyped up even though he's on the sidelines. I mean, show some of that stuff so these kids can not only hear it, most of us are visual learners. I want to be able to see what it looks like. And then also show what it looks like to be negative. With student athletes, Jake, you have to get crystal clear on what is above the line and below the line, so there is no confusion at all. If you have kids, you understand this, right? So it's the same thing with athletes. Don't assume that they know. Show them video of what it looks like to be above, what it looks like to be below, and then also talk about, hey, if it's below, this is what's going to happen because it's below. Do we all agree with this? Are we all on the same page? And before the season starts, I want everybody in that room to be on the same page. This is above the line. This is below the line. That's what I do with some of my work when I do some consulting and mental performance coaching with teams, is laying out that framework so we're all on the same page. So when somebody gets busted for drugs or alcohol, and we all agreed that's below the line, okay, what's going to be the punishment? How are we going to move forward on this? Because you guys told me that these are your above the line and below the line. I didn't tell you. These are your rules. This is your team. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, no, and I love that because I think it's something very similar we talk about here in regards to kind of corporate leadership, right? As adults, we've got to establish standards. We got to clearly define it because sometimes we have different definitions of the same word. We have to know what examples of it are, and then we have to reinforce it with verbal affirmations and encouragement when we see it, call out the good. And we got to hold people accountable when we see it below the line to that point. I love when you talk about student athletes. I love Julie Fournier of Ball is Psych. She talks about, body language mental toughness has to do with your body language, right? Your body language is a billboard for your mental toughness of like, is it below the line of when you slump your shoulders and drop? And Jalen Hurts is one. I did a YouTube video when that came out of like parents show your kids him. But one of the examples I wrote about in my last book is Paul Heipler with Abilene Christian. And I asked some student athletes out of college recently, I said, hey, if you were going to be in March Madness, your school was in March Madness, and all of a sudden CBS keeps showing you on national TV and the announcers are talking about you, and your picture is posted everywhere after the game when your team pulls the upset, how many people in the room want that? I said, cool, now keep your hands up if you're okay knowing you never got on the court. And it's like, what? It's like, you want the attention, but here's what it came with. And so then we tell the story of Paul and how he just like, he was the guy on the bench. Like he wasn't going to play. He was a senior, but he was hooping and hollering and yelling and high-fiving and all into the game. And he was being the best teammate in that moment, owning his role, even though he wasn't going to get to play. And I said,
Man,
that's
so cool.
what it looks like to be a great teammate. That's what that standard is. So I really love that answer of defining it. I think that's something as leaders in the workplace, how well are we defining and then reinforcing that behavior, as Kaner would say, right? Rewarded behavior is repeated behavior. And so the more we can reinforce and push that, the better off it's going to be. Okay, so let's switch gears because we've teased around it a little bit. One of the things I love, so I've teased it up, Push the Sled, I really enjoyed the book. And as someone who, similar to you, right, we've gone through Kaner's Mental Performance Mastery certification. I've been just kind of like you, a junkie in this space of what can I learn. I love seeing how you position and taught a lot of the things because you make it very simple for grasping. And I think that's really important with your intended audience as well. The other thing, what I'm fascinated by, and I'm curious on you, is the way you wrote the book. So you follow the fable format, right? The John Gordons, the Patrick Lencioni's. You tell the story in that story format. My brain does not work that way. I have sat down 5 different times trying to write a book that way, and I scrap it because I'm like, I can't formulate the story like that. Talk to me about what inspired you to say, this is the way I want to teach these concepts. And then tell me about some of the inspirations for the story, because obviously you pull in some big hitters like Matt Carpenter, proud Horned Frogs, as you can imagine, right? I noticed some different folks in there. So tell me about the inspirations behind it, as well as kind of what made you and your dad say this is the best way to tell this story.
Yeah, well, we knew that our target audience was going to be high school and college athletes, and we also know just the power of story. And it's at that age, well, actually at all ages, we learn so well through story. And so we've seen the success, obviously, through John Gordon, Joshua Medcalf, who wrote Chop Wood, Carry Water. Yep. I mean, there's so many examples out there. I've had the chance to have both those guys on my podcast and talk about the power of story. And so that had me sold, was that I think the best way to talk about this is to really get in the lives of student athletes. And so, as you know, the book is in a setting at a make-believe school here in Minnesota, Pine Lake High School, and it goes through the summer strength and conditioning program. And being a high school athlete, I was a part of that summer strength conditioning program for 4 years, so I understood when it starts, when people usually drop off, when it ends. I had some good background of what that looks like, and I also knew that every top tier, if you will, school, they have a summer strength conditioning program. So hopefully, ideally, everybody can relate to this who's going to be reading the book. So that was the idea of making sure that, or wanting the story kind of, instead of having some sort of a different type of outlet. So that was first and foremost. And then the first thing we had to do is create my framework. And so the framework, if you haven't read the book, listeners, is 7 skills, 7 tactical skills. Because I believe that in order to create an elevated mindset, we first need to do drills that create the 7 skills to have an elevated mindset. So just like if you're an athlete at any sport, if you want to have the skill of, say, lateral speed, I'm thinking like a shortstop, you're going to have to do some drills in order to get there. So it could be some ladders, some skater hops, some side lunges, something lateral. Those are the drills to develop the skill of being a shortstop or having lateral speed, and the skill set of being a baseball player. So that's the framework, is that we wanted to break things down and give kids some really tactical pieces that they could go do, and that was the how. And so we had this framework of these 7 skills, and then it was figuring out what characters we want involved. And it's kind of this fun process, Jake, because it starts with nothing. It starts with, what do we want to do here? And we had some really fun brainstorming sessions between my dad, myself, and also Brian Kane, who weighed in as well, just figuring out, what is this going to look like? And what's so cool about this, man, is you start with nothing, a blank slate, and then you start throwing out all these ideas, and then the ideas start growing in your head, and then it starts to get on paper, and now you start visualizing what these people look like, and the story comes to life, man. I tell you what, it's so interesting now walking around even my town and just seeing like, oh man, that looks like Jackson, who's the main character in the book, or man, I could really it just comes to life, man. So that's a really cool part of it. And so each character really has an inspiration. We have people that come in and speak to the team, and each person that comes in is an inspiration off of somebody that I've interviewed on my podcast. So there's a reason why we put in each character, and I would also go as far as saying like each word is carefully chosen. My dad and I went through several edits making sure that this was the exact word that we wanted to use here and there. So it's a very intentional book. Not everybody will know why we pick certain things, but that's okay. We can keep that between him and I as well. It's kind of a fun project for us.
I love it. Well, it was interesting because as I was reading, and obviously some of the names I recognize, some of the folks obviously from Minnesota, famous athletes, coaches, alums. But I was curious as well of like, okay, which of these folks have you like interacted with? You knew, you're like, I'm pulling them in, but it makes complete sense from the podcast standpoint as well. Awesome. So I love the concepts. And as I shared for parents, like I actually just this weekend was with one of my best friends. His kid was getting baptized. And I was like, hey, I've got a book for you. I got a book for you too. He's 9. He's a little younger, but like I would rather you two read this book together now, and then he's in a great position later. So we were already chatting about the book. And so we've got it linked here in the show notes. Going to highly, highly encourage you to grab a copy of the book. You obviously want to check out DJ's podcast as well. You'll recognize a lot of familiar faces on there from Hannah Huseman, Lauren Johnson, a lot of our crossover Caner, folks like that you've probably heard here. DJ's got different questions and conversations with them as well. So there's going to be a ton of value with that. Let me ask you, okay, so now the book's done. The next question always becomes, when's the next one, right? Have you already started thinking about the process? Because for me, man, when I finished book 1, it was like finishing like a grueling workout and like I want a breather. Mm-hmm. And then when you start, you're like, I'm excited about the idea of having the next book, but the work required to do it is like, oh, it's tough. It's the same feeling in a much scaled down version. Let me preface that. As an athlete coming off of a championship, right? You get the championship. It feels amazing. Man, we got to do it all over again. And so you have to kind of rework it. So for you, has your brain even gone that direction yet with kind of talking with your dad of like what's next? Or is it like right now we're just going to be where our feet are in this season and then we'll deal with that later?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, during the process, one of the hardest things, Jake, was we had a page number that we kind of wanted to be at. It actually started at, we wanted to be at like between 125 and 135. And if you read the book, you know that it ends up at about 175 because we just had a hard time taking stuff out. And the conversation that we kept having back and forth was, hey, we'll save this, we'll put this in the next one. Hey, we'll save this, we'll put this in the next one. We can't add to push the sled, we'll save it. And I'm like, you know, so during the process, we were already thinking about the next one. This is push the sled. We've talked about maybe pull the sled. We've had some people ask us too, you know, there's a bunch of characters in the book, and the book ends at the end of the summer. So everybody wants to know, well, what happens next? You know, what happens during the season? And so, yes, there is a little bit of a teaser there. I will say, man, it was much more work than I thought it was going to be real candid with you. It's one thing, you know this, man. It's one thing to write it, but then there's Amazon, and then there's the cover, and then there's the formatting. I mean, it is just getting it on text is 20% of it. There's so much more. So right now, our plan is that it took a year to write and finish. We went from April to April, and now we're going to go focus on a year of selling it, and then maybe next April we can talk about the next one. But right now we're in the process of making sure that it gets into as many people's, and coaches and athletes' hands as possible.
Absolutely love it. And so, hey, that's actually a great question for you. I know right now you've got Amazon. For any of our coaches listening, because I know I've got some high school, college coaches that tune in every week, do you guys do group discounts? So like if they want to order, hey, I want to order it from my whole coaching staff or all of our athletes, is the best way to send them directly to your website for those bulk orders?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Jake. So the website, if you're going to do multiple orders, is pushthesled.com. So if you want to get any more than 2 copies, we have discounts from 2 to 10, so on and so forth. And then also what we're including, Jake, we're working on right now, we're almost done, is we're creating a book club discussion guide / workbook for teams. So you get the book, you also get a workbook to go through. Hey, let's really dive into this. Let's have some discussions about some of the topics that we got into this. And there's also some activities. So it's not just the book. We hope that it's something that, a coach can just say, great, give me the books, give me the workbook. I don't have to do anything else. I just become a facilitator. And what I've found just in Minnesota up here working with some top tier programs is the best programs that I've been around, they're doing book clubs. They're doing off-season book clubs. They're finding ways to create chemistry through the word and through books. So this is something that we're working on right now. It should be done in the next few weeks.
Love it. Love it. All right, listeners, we've got it linked here in the show notes. Coaches, athletes listening, grab a copy of this book. Parents, I'm going to highly recommend it with you as well. Grab a copy for your kid, maybe read it, have some good discussion points. We know post-game, right, the most important conversations you have are not necessarily about the outcomes, the hits, the wins, but it's the questions you can ask in that process. And I think this book will give you some really cool questions and prompts, not directly, but about different aspects of the mental game, right? The reset and refocus. Hey, what's our process for this? Little things like that will teach the mental performance, a lot of the things that DJ talks about, that I talk about, and really distill it in a very clean way that you can have those conversations with your kid. So highly recommend it. We've got it linked here in the show notes, as well as DJ's Instagram and social media, because you definitely want to give this guy a follow. Dude, this was fun. Thanks for coming on the show this week.
This was fun, man. Hey, before I let you go, one question that I've been asking people because it's been fun for me is, what was your favorite part of the book? It's a fun question for me to hear the answer for people too. Was there a piece that you had underlined or a piece that really resonated with you? I'd just love to know.
Yeah, so I've got it, and I'm going to butcher the phrase exactly, but it was, as a horned frog, it was the Matt Carpenter Zoom call, right? For those not listening, he's a TCU guy, played St. Louis Cardinals, MLB stud, but he talked about the preparation. And I actually made a note because I was like, I said I should do, it made me just want to do a little riff on Instagram around it. And I'm going to pull up my notes around, so you can probably phrase his quote exactly around preparing for the moment and the sign he has in his garage. But I said, do your actions follow your belief? Because if you prepare for an opportunity, you treat it differently than if you hope for an opportunity. If you hope it's coming, you take a day off. If you know it's coming, you prepare every day because you don't want to waste the chance. And so what's the exact quote that Carpenter used?
So he talks about the chapter is chance favors the prepared. And Abraham Lincoln once said, I will prepare and someday my chance will come. And that was written on his wall in his gym. Wow. And so there's the power of preparation is just that. I love that that TCU guy. I shouldn't be surprised that's what you liked.
It is. And that was, I mean, like I said, like I love the story format. It was easy, but that was one of the things when I read it, and we always talk about it, right? You got to own the shadows to shine in the spotlight. You got to do the work to prepare for your moment before you come. But when I read it that specific moment, I was upstairs on the Peloton, just writing and reading because I was like, I don't want to sit here. And the thing that stood out to me was like great question to ask people of like, you can say it, but what do your actions say? Like if you truly believe the opportunity is coming, you will behave in a different way than if you hope you get an opportunity. And that's a real sign, right? That's the difference in a lot of people, even at the highest level of, I hope I get in and I'm going to dominate when I get in, but I'm not preparing for it. And similar to, I was going to say, the main guy in the book, like I was the kid I wasn't thrown into the situation he was in, but my junior year, I was thrown in and I was not ready my first few games because I was like, I'm the backup this year. And then once I got in and back, the starter came back and then I got back again, I was like, I have to own this, that I'm the starter, regardless of whether I'm actually starting or not. And it changed my perception from then on forward, but I was like, I can relate to that. And so that quote really stood out to me. It was one of those things. And as, we've teased a little bit, there's a lot of really catchy lines in it, right? So like my first book, I wanted the chapters to be quick, easy, outwork your talent, choose your start. I wanted things that you could say to your kid and be quick, hey, what's your starting lineup? And your book does a really good job of those same things. It takes the teaching concepts and puts them in a very quick and easy. So parents, leaders, like it's an easy thing to jot the phrase down. And if you've established it and you understand what it means, it helps you shed that light and reinforce it. So I want to push that and praise that. And I think both of us picked up a lot of those things from Kaner and how well he's done with that process of teaching a lot of that. So can't say enough great things. And congrats, man. I know the road to getting the book, like you said, written is 20%. It's a tough 20%, but it's still the smallest part of the process. And it's kind of no different than you getting on stage or your dad getting on stage. Like the piece we're on stage is like 10 to 20%. It's everything else that goes into it that sets that up. And so I think that's always something for us as listeners to keep in mind is the final outcomes we see are only the tip of the iceberg that we talk about, right? It's that 10 to 15%. And really it's if we can become obsessed with how do we develop the 85 to 90 below the water and not stress about the outcome, as Bill Walsh said, right? You win your championship trophies in practice, you pick them up on game day. Just focus on the practice. The outcomes take care of themselves. And some days you win, some days you lose. But if you go all out in that effort, you don't have the regret of what if. And so I just want to commend you on that and reinforce that to everybody listening of grab the book. It's an easy read. It's straightforward, but it's got so much packed in there that it's going to be able to not only easy to digest and consume, but easy to spread. And so I want to highly encourage you to grab that. So DJ, man, props to you.
The separation is in preparation, man. That's it. It's separate. That's what the whole camp was. Separation is in preparation, right? You care about what you prepare about. And so if you're lacking confidence, if you're not sure, preparation, dial up your preparation and the rest will take care of itself, man. That's why that's a huge theme of this book. Separation is in the preparation.